Dawn breaks over the trench, but the battlefield is already awake. A hand shakes around a grenade, the pin pulled free with the teeth before the arm whips forward and throws it into the smoke. For 1 second, nothing happens. Then the blast tears through the trench wall, throwing mud, splinters, iron, and bodies into the air. A machine gun opens somewhere beyond the wire, its belt jerking through the feed while bullets cut low across the ground. Nearby, an artillery crew drags another shell into place, rams it into the gun, locks the breech, and fires. The recoil kicking the whole weapon backward as the sky flashes and the earth shudders again. Men shout through the smoke, some climbing up with rifles, others dropping back into the mud as one is hit through the shoulder and another jerks from a shot in the chest. Blood spreading dark across the tunic before he falls. Gas masks swing against coats. Stretcher bearers slip in the filth. And above it, all the shellfire keeps coming, as if the war has forgotten how to stop. Before 1914, Europe looked powerful, rich and confident. But beneath the surface, it was armed for catastrophe. The great powers were building huge armies, expanding conscription, and drawing up war plans built on speed and total mobilization. Britain and Germany were locked in a naval arms race, each trying to outbuild the other in battleships. Empires competed for colonies, trade, and prestige across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Nationalist anger simmered inside old multinational states like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Alliances hardened, rivalries deepened, and leaders increasingly believed that if war came, it would come soon, and must be won fast. Europe's alliances turned fear into machinery. On one side stood the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other stood the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. These were not just signatures on paper. They were promises backed by timetables, railways, reserves, and war plans waiting in locked drawers. In staff rooms, officers bent over maps under lamplight, tracing arrows toward borders long before war began. Pencils dragging across maps, medals on dark uniforms, diplomats exchanging tight looks, and telegraph needles clicking. The danger was simple. Once one capital moved, others could not stay still. The Balkans were the most dangerous corner of Europe because too many ambitions were packed into too little land. Serbia wanted greater influence and dreamed of uniting South Slavs. Austria-Hungary feared that dream because it threatened to tear apart its own empire from within. Russia saw itself as protector of Slavic peoples. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was weakening, leaving old territories exposed and contested. This made southeastern Europe a zone of rivalry, pride, and unfinished wars. Before Sarajevo, the Balkans already felt like a fuse burning toward powder. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie entered Sarajevo in an open car, moving through a city already tense with danger. Earlier, a bomb had been thrown at the motorcade, but the Archduke survived and continued on. That should have ended the attempt. Instead, confusion opened the fatal path. The driver took a wrong turn, the car slowed, and suddenly Gavrilo Princip was standing only steps away. The Archduke turning his head, Sophie beside him. Princip's hand tightening around the pistol, his breathing shallow, the barrel lifting, then the shots. Panic breaks instantly, faces blanch, people scatter, and the royal car stops in shock and blood. Sarajevo did not create war by itself, it gave men in government the excuse to force one. In Vienna, the murder was treated not as a crime to investigate, but as a chance to break Serbia. Austria-Hungary drafted an ultimatum meant to humiliate, then leaned on German backing to make it stick. Serbia accepted most demands, but not enough to satisfy a court already thinking in terms of punishment. The crisis moved through telegrams, sealed papers, and rooms full of men staring at clocks while pretending compromise still existed. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. A killing in one city had become a test of wills between empires. Once the orders went out, diplomacy lost the race to railways. Russia began to mobilize, Germany answered, France prepared, and Britain watched the map tighten by the hour. What had been argued in ministries now moved in steel, troop trains, horse lines, reserve depots, baggage wagons, marching columns, and station platforms packed with men who thought they might be home by Christmas. That is the eerie twist of 1914. The continent entered catastrophe with banners, handshakes, and cheering crowds. Wives held faces for one last second, officers checked lists, whistles blew, and whole populations stepped into war before most understood what modern firepower would do to them. The war widened the moment Germany chose speed over restraint. To reach France fast, German armies moved through neutral Belgium, even after Belgium refused passage. The invasion turned strategy into spectacle. Boots crossing borders at dawn, columns vanishing into mist, civilians abandoning roads with carts and children, church towers watching armies pass beneath them. Then came the harder consequence. Britain had demanded that Belgian neutrality be respected, and when it was violated, Britain entered the war. What had looked like a continental struggle between rival blocs now became something larger and harder to contain. Belgium was not just a route on a map, it was the doorway through which Europe stepped into full war. Germany's opening gamble nearly worked. By early September 1914, German armies had driven deep into France and come within roughly 30 miles of Paris, feeding the illusion that the war might still be decided in one giant sweep. Then the rhythm broke. French commanders, reinforced in part by troops rushed from Paris, struck at the exposed German flank near the Marne. The battle was not a neat turning point in one field. It was a sudden reversal of momentum across exhausted marching columns, shattered assumptions, and command decisions made under pressure. By September 10, the Germans were retreating toward the Aisne. The quick war dream did not survive the Marne. It fell back, dug in, and began to harden into something far worse. After the Marne, neither side accepted stalemate. Instead, both tried to escape it by moving north, each attempting to turn the other's flank before the line closed. This is why the next phase feels almost ghostly. Armies marching, countermarking, probing, digging, shifting again, all while the front stretched farther and farther toward the channel. On maps, it looks like a movement of lines. On the ground, it meant exhausted men crossing fields, throwing up earthworks, sleeping in wet uniforms, and realizing that every attempt to get around the enemy only lengthened the war's edge. When the line finally reached the sea, Europe had not found freedom of movement. It had built the frame of the Western Front. Then, the earth itself became the battlefield's architecture. Men disappeared underground into firing bays, dugouts, duckboards, and walls of mud held together by timber and sandbags. No man's land lay ahead. Wire, craters, bodies, broken trees, and the constant possibility of being seen first and killed first. The terror here was not only attack but duration, lice in clothing, rats over parapets, trench foot in wet boots, snipers waiting for carelessness, shell fire that could arrive before thought, and gas drills that turned breathing into discipline. This is where World War I found its human face. Not only in the charge, but in the waiting, the rotting, and the knowledge that the next few feet of ground might cost hundreds of lives. Russia attacked East Prussia in August 1914 before its mobilization was truly complete, hoping to relieve pressure on France by forcing Germany to divide its attention. Instead, the move exposed a fatal weakness: speed without coordination. Two Russian armies entered East Prussia, but poor communications, scattered command, and unsecured radio messages let the Germans read the situation almost in real time. At Tannenberg, German forces under Hindenburg and Ludendorff turned inward and crushed General Samsonov's Second Army between August 26 and 30. The eastern battlefield looked nothing like the trenches of France: cavalry screens, open ground, long marches, and encirclement. By the end, Russia had lost almost an entire army and hundreds of guns. The Eastern Front never settled into one continuous trench wall the way the West did. It was larger, looser, and far more unstable, stretching across East Prussia, Galicia, and the Polish salient. That scale exposed Austria-Hungary quickly. Its armies suffered badly in 1914 and 1915, especially against Russia in Galicia, and the empire's command systems struggled to match the pressure of modern war. Germany increasingly had to stiffen Austro-Hungarian lines, weaving its own formations into its allies' front to prevent collapse. This made the East a war of movement, retreat, railways, and exhaustion rather than fixed stalemate alone. Broad plains, battered trains, and half-broken staffs gave the theatre a restless, unravelling character. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war in late 1914, the conflict stopped being only a European land struggle and became unmistakably imperial and global. Its entry brought the Dardanelles, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean into the war's geography. Britain and France soon declared war, and in 1915, the Allies launched the Gallipoli campaign to force the Dardanelles, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and open a route to Russia through the Straits. What followed was not a swift breakthrough, but a grinding disaster. Warships in narrow water, landings under fire, steep ridges, Ottoman trenches above the beaches, and Allied troops pinned down below them for months. Italy had belonged to the Triple Alliance, but in 1915 it switched sides after the secret Treaty of London promised territory at Austria-Hungary's expense. On May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary and opened a front unlike any other in Europe. Here the war climbed into the Alps and along the Isonzo, where cold, altitude, rock and narrow ridges became weapons in themselves. Guns had to be dragged up slopes, roads hacked out of mountainsides, and men forced to fight where footing could kill as easily as bullets. Instead of wide plains or trench belts, the Italian front offered avalanches, cliff positions, and repeated offensives that cost heavily for little gain. World War I became mechanized slaughter because industry kept finding new ways to reach the human body. Machine guns turned open ground into killing zones. Heavy artillery smashed trenches, villages, and nerves long before an infantry assault arrived. In April 1915 at Ypres, chlorine gas rolled across Allied lines and introduced a new kind of panic, a weapon that invaded the lungs. Aircraft, once used mainly for observation, began fighting each other and directing artillery. Flamethrowers appeared in trench assaults. Submarines carried war under the sea. Then, in September 1916, on the Somme, the British Mark I became the first tank to see battle. Verdun was not just a battle, it was a machine for consuming men. On February 21, 1916, Germany opened its offensive against the Verdun sector, aiming at a place the French could not politically or psychologically afford to abandon. That was the logic: force France to defend symbolic ground until the defense itself became ruin. The result was 10 months of artillery flashes, shattered forts, erased villages, smoke, rotation columns, and landscape pulverized into mud and chalk. The line bent, recovered, and held, but at an immense cost. Verdun became one of the longest and bloodiest engagements of the war, with roughly 300,000 killed and around 700,000 total casualties. It turned endurance into horror and horror into national myth. When the Somme opened on July 1st, 1916, the Allies believed that a week-long bombardment had smashed the German line enough for infantry to walk forward and take it. It had not. Whistles blew, ladders went up, and entire waves of British soldiers moved into a battlefield still covered by machine guns, wire, and intact strongpoints. By nightfall, the British had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including about 20,000 dead, the bloodiest day in their military history. The battle dragged on for months, consuming men for limited ground and turning offensive warfare into arithmetic. Later came a new machine, the tank, but even that could not rescue the Somme from becoming attrition's most famous graveyard. The war at sea did not usually look like trench slaughter, but it strangled nations just as surely. Britain used its navy to enforce a blockade that slowly choked Germany's access to food and raw materials, turning hunger into strategy. Germany answered beneath the surface, with U-boats stalking merchant ships through grey water and trying to break Britain's lifeline before Britain broke Germany's endurance. This made the ocean a civilian battlefield as well as a military one. Freighters vanished, crews died in freezing water, and every convoy became a test of time and luck. Even Jutland, the war's biggest fleet battle, settled little tactically, because the deeper truth remained: Britain still held command of the sea. Russia did not collapse in one dramatic instant. It came apart through fatigue, hunger, defeat, and the growing sense that the state no longer knew how to hold itself together. By 1917, the war had strained transport, emptied shops, and filled cities with breadlines and anger. In Petrograd, crowds gathered in the cold while discipline inside the army weakened and confidence in the monarchy drained away. The February Revolution overthrew the imperial government. The October Revolution later brought the Bolsheviks to power. What makes Russia so important in the war is not just that it fell, but how it fell. A giant empire unraveling from inside while still trying to fight a modern industrial war it could no longer carry. The United States did not join the war at the beginning, but by 1917, Germany had helped close that distance itself. Unrestricted submarine warfare threatened ships and lives across the Atlantic, while the Zimmermann telegram turned fear into direct political alarm. In that message, Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. And once it became public, it inflamed opinion dramatically. Then, the war stopped feeling European and began to feel personal. President Wilson moved toward intervention, Congress followed, and American industry, finance, transport, and manpower entered the conflict. The balance did not change overnight, but the psychological shift was immense. Germany now faced an enemy with fresh armies and enormous economic weight. After the Bolsheviks seized power, they wanted out of the war more than they wanted a dignified peace. The result was Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918, a treaty that removed Russia from World War I, but at a punishing territorial price. The negotiations were cold, unequal, and revealing, one side desperate to stop bleeding, the other eager to exploit that weakness before events changed again in the West. For Germany, the treaty meant relief and opportunity. Divisions tied down in the east could now be shifted westward for one last attempt to win the war before American strength fully arrived. On the map, the eastern battlefield began to clear. In reality, it was only making room for a final collision elsewhere. With Russia gone, Germany tried to turn temporary advantage into decision. In spring 1918, Ludendorff launched a series of offensives on the Western Front, using elite shock troops trained in infiltration tactics, move fast, bypass strongpoints, penetrate weak seams, and break the line before the Allies could recover. This was not the armoured speed of later wars, but it was the closest Dubois came to renewed operational movement after years of deadlock. At first, the attacks shocked the Allies and gained ground. Trenches were overrun, fog-swallowed positions, and entire sectors bent backward under sudden pressure. But the advances burned through Germany's best troops and did not achieve a decisive strategic victory. Breakthrough had returned, escape had not. Then the war changed direction for the last time. Beginning in August 1918, the Allies launched a sustained series of blows that became known as the 100 Days Offensive. Tanks, artillery, infantry, aircraft, and tightening coordination pushed the Germans back again and again, while the Central Powers were weakening everywhere else. Austria-Hungary was fraying into national fragments. The Ottoman Empire was failing. Germany itself was exhausted, hungry, and increasingly unstable at home. What makes this phase so powerful is that the front finally starts moving again just as whole states begin to crack behind it. The battlefield opens, retreats multiply, and imperial structures that looked permanent start collapsing almost at once. The guns stopped on November 11th, 1918, but silence did not mean resolution. The Armistice ended the fighting. It did not settle the meaning of the war. That came later, at Versailles, where Germany and the Allied powers signed the treaty on June 28, 1919. Formally, it ended the war with Germany. Politically, it left resentment, accusation, and instability behind it. The treaty redrew borders, imposed penalties, and convinced many Germans that peace had been dictated rather than agreed. So the ending of World War I carries a double image. Railway carriage negotiations and silent front lines on one side, bitterness and unfinished consequences on the other. The war was over, but its aftermath was already shaping the next disaster.